I've been made aware of the grieving that people go through and the yearning that they have for meaning and the connections that they long for, and how really underneath the surface of our very sometimes American kind of paper thin kind of facades, we are very deep and we do care about what matters in life and our faith and things like that. And my life ever since then has been in that direction. I never wrote another sports book after that.
Hey there, folks. Welcome to the Eric Metaxas Show. I have a guest right now. My bet is that you have heard of him. You may have read some of his books. His name is Mitch Albom. He is the author of a book called Tuesdays with Morrie. I know you've heard of it. It was made into a film, a TV movie. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for like 4 years. And speaking as an author, I want to say I deeply resent you, Mitch Albom. Welcome to the program.
Well, outside of the resentment, thank you for having me on the program.
The resentment is bitter, but I'm going to let it go. There's no reason to cling to bitterness. No, seriously, that is, as an author, you know, who is familiar with some of these metrics, that is an extraordinary thing. And the book that sits atop a bestseller list for years is extremely rare. The only one I can think of offhand is M. Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled, which is also a book about, hey, what's the meaning of life? Right. So I want to ask you, first of all, you have a new book out. I want to mention that up front, and it is a novel called The Stranger in the Lifeboat. Is this your first novel?
Oh, no. It's I've written about 7 novels.
All right. So maybe it's your 7th novel. But you're most known for Tuesdays with Morrie. Tell the story behind that for people who are unaware. They still exist, some people who are unaware of how that happened for you.
Sure. Well, it was really quite an accident. So actually, the fact that it stayed on those bestsellers lists for that long is even more remarkable because it wasn't ever supposed to be a book. I had seen my old college professor, Maury Schwartz, on Nightline with Ted Koppel. He was talking about what it was like to die from Lou Gehrig's disease. And I had been very close with him when I was back in college, but then I had lost touch with him as I had gone on to chase my career and my ambition. And for 16 years, I never got back in touch with him. And all of a sudden, I saw him on television basically saying he had a few months left to live. So I went to go visit him. And one visit turned into 2. 2 turned to 3, 4, 5, 6. It was never supposed to be a book, Eric. It was just him kind of counseling me on what's important in life once you really know you're going to die, as he did, and how you can change your life to live accordingly. And I only decided to write a book when I found out he was in debt for his medical bills, and he didn't have the money to pay it. So I thought, well, maybe there's a way I can help raise money for him. And believe it or not, most of the publishers in New York told me, get lost. We have no interest in a book like this. It's depressing. You're a sports writer. You can't write a book like this. And only 3 weeks before he died did we find a publisher. And they only printed 20,000 copies. And I took all the money and gave it to him. And that was supposed to be the end of it. And it was supposed to be a little labor of love.
And the moral of the story is publishers are stupid. I mean, you have to laugh because how many times have we heard this story? Before I give you the opportunity to tell what happened, but I mean, how many times do you hear that, you know, Hemingway's Sun Also Rises rejected 27 times, or you hear this story over and over again. It's almost comical. I mean, here you have a book that ends up being wildly successful, and you are begging people to publish it, and nobody seems to get it. Why do you think that was? Is it because you're known as a sports writer? Is it what do you think it was?
I mean, the lesson that I take from it is more do things for the right reason, and you'd be amazed how things work out. You know, I would have given up, Eric, honestly, if it was just for me, because you get that many rejections and that many publishers telling you, no, it's not a good idea. You think, okay, this is not a good idea for my career. But because I was doing it to pay his medical bills, no was not an option. I mean, I had to find somebody. And so we pushed forward and we did. I can't blame them for, doubting me. I was a sports writer. I'd never written anything like that before. I think that's part of the reason the book came across maybe the way it did, because I wasn't aiming it at anybody. I wasn't trying to write a how-to self-help bestseller. I was just writing a story about what happened between me and this lovely old man.
Actually, that's very, very interesting, Mitch. You're quite right. I often find that when you come from outside, whether it's a genre or a discipline, oftentimes you bring fresh eyes to it, and I think that that's what happened here. And yes, you're right. You can't blame publishers for going with the flow. Like they basically, it's kind of like they're insurance adjusters, right? They've got some numbers, and they go, nah, this is not going to do well. And based on that, they're right. But sometimes you need a little more vision than actuarial tables. And so in this case, who eventually decided to take a chance on you and this idea?
It was a publisher called Doubleday, and 3 weeks before Morrie died, and I remember Morrie made a tape for them because they were never going to meet him, and he made this beautiful little tape where a cassette tape that I pressed play and record, and he said, go, and he didn't want to practice, and he said, hello, good people of Doubleday, this is Morrie Schwartz, thank you for publishing this book, we're going to make a beautiful symphony together, me and Mitch, and I won't be there when it comes out to see it. But I want you to know wherever I am, I'll be watching. And I thought, wow, that's perfect. And I think that kind of hung over them. They felt a little obligated to, put something behind it. But honestly, Eric, when it came out, as I say, they only published 20,000 copies. It didn't come out on a bestseller list or anything like that. It was word of mouth. Back in those days, people could read something and hand it on to somebody. A bookstore could recommend it, hand it on to somebody. It doesn't really happen that much anymore, because so many small bookstores are gone. But back in those days, that's how books spread. And eventually, I think it was, about 9 months after it came out, it went to number 1 on the bestsellers list, and then it stayed there for 4 years.
Astonishing. Well, I know why it did so well, because you talked about what everybody eventually comes to care about. What is the meaning of life? Viktor Frankl and others have just made it really clear that is unavoidably what people care about, what's important at the end of the day. And here you're talking to a man facing the end of his days. Now, up until that point, where were you in life in terms of spirituality? Was God important to you growing up? And at what point in these conversations with your former professor did this become real for you?
I would say, to be honest, I was at that point in my life extremely self-centered. I was focused on my own career, my own ambition. I had been raised with a lot of religion. I went to a religious school, and then I went to a religious high school as well. And then I kind of faded away from it, and I thought I'll just do things on my own. And I was very successful, and so I had no reason not to think that was the way to go, until I realized, as I was sitting there alongside him as he was dying, that pretty much everything that he said that was important was the opposite of what had become important to me. And I don't know, it's something about, when you're with your old teachers, you realize they know better than you do. And I said, he's 10 times happier with his life than you are, and you're 37 years old and healthy, and he's 78 and dying. What's wrong with the picture? And I began to change my life slowly after that. And then what really happened, Eric, is the book kind of changed my life for me. Because people used to come up to me as a sports writer and say, hey, who's going to win the Super Bowl in the airport? And I would say, Patriots, and I just keep walking. And then all of a sudden, after this book became popular, people came up to me and said, hey, my mother died of cancer, and the last thing we did was read your book together. Can I talk to you? And you can't say Patriots and keep walking. You have to stop, and you have to listen. And I stopped and listened and stopped and listened tens and hundreds and thousands of times, which has been my life ever since that book came out. And I've been made aware of the grieving that people go through and the yearning that they have for meaning and the connections that they long for, and how really underneath the surface of our very sometimes American kind of paper-thin kind of facades, we are very deep, and we do care about what matters in life and our faith and things like that. And my life ever since then has been in that direction. I never wrote another sports book after that. I've written 10 books since Tuesdays with Morrie, and all of them have dealt with topics like, one of the things that Morrie and I discussed on one of those Tuesdays, including the stranger in the lifeboat.
Did he? And obviously, I want to talk to you about your novel. But before I ask you about that, because you do talk about God, but was he talking about meaning and significant things apart from God, or was God how he processed this?
Morrie was raised Jewish, and from what I am told, a pretty religious household. And then as he got older and got into being a professor and all, he kind of moved away from it. He described himself kind of as an agnostic. But then as he started to die, and as Lou Gehrig's disease, which was taking him, robbed him of his ability to walk or lift his arms or bathe himself or whatever, and he was basically in a chair. He needed to have his head tilted from side to side just to look at you. You need to have someone to wipe his own rear end for him. All the dignities that we associate with life having been taken away, he began to change. And he started to say, I'm having conversations with God now. I'm negotiating if I get to be one of the angels.
I want to, let's hit pause. Folks, we're talking about the most important things in life with Mitch Albom. Hey there, folks. I'm talking to Mitch Albom. The new book is The Stranger in the Lifeboat. I want to talk about that, but I want to let you finish, Mitch. You were talking about how the man that, Morrie, who you're talking to at the end of his life, began to reconsider God. How did he put it? You were just phrasing it beautifully.
He said, I'm negotiating with him now. I want to see if I get to be one of the angels. And I'm sure he wasn't the only person on earth when he suddenly realized he had a terminal illness, kind of turned to the idea of God as comfort. In many ways, that's kind of what The Stranger in the Lifeboat, my newest one, is about. And as I said, all my books since Tuesdays with Morrie kind of contain some kind of element of something that I went through with Morrie when we talked, because we talked every Tuesday about a different thing in life. And I guess the idea of crying out for help really became the theme of my newest book.
It's interesting because we live in a culture, I think, where a lot of people, for some reason, they almost feel like it's culturally unacceptable to talk about God. But when you're dying, it is the most logical thing. And I guess it makes you wonder, even if you didn't believe in God objectively, you'd say, well, why do I have that instinct? And is it possible that I have that instinct because God is real?
Exactly.
What do you... So how do you frame this? Tell us the plot to the extent that you want to of the new novel.
You really set it up beautifully without even realizing it. So the way it begins is there's this explosion on this luxury yacht where all these rich people are celebrating, and everyone's killed except 10 people who managed to get to a life raft. Half of them are the guests from the cruise, and half of them are servants, people who work there. And for 3 days, they're out in the middle of the ocean. Nobody's coming for them. They're running out of food and water. They see sharks. They're crying out in their own way for help. And then suddenly they see this body floating in the water. And they pull the body in. It's this young guy, kind of nondescript, average-looking guy. And they pepper him with questions. He doesn't say anything. And finally, one of the women says, well, thank the Lord we found you. And he says, I am the Lord. And that's the way it begins. And it becomes this parable of when we cry out for help. And you're right, you're so right. When people get in trouble, what's the first thing they say? Oh, God, please help me. Even if they're not religious, they say, please, God, help me. And these people on the boat don't believe this guy is who he says he is because he looks like an average Joe. And they say, well, what are you doing here if you're God? And he says, well, haven't you been calling me? I came because you were calling me. And they say, well, are you going to save us? And he says, I can only do that if everybody in the boat believes I am who I say I am at the same time. And it becomes this challenge as the days get tougher and tougher and the things become more and more dire and they run more out of food and water and the sharks attack. Do they choose to believe what's right in front of them, or do they just cling to their own systems that have gotten them through life up to that point?
Now, I'm a Christian, but I don't know, is this Christian or Judeo-Christian or biblical? I mean, it sounds like you're at least talking about the biblical God.
Yeah, I'd call it Judeo-Christian, absolutely. I think Jews, Christians would relate to it. But the challenge is, when we ask for help in America, or really around the world, it seems to me like we expect it to come like that. Please, God, make this go away. And when it doesn't, we think our prayers aren't being answered. And I have found in my life, having lived a while now, that God has his own timing. And problems get solved when God decides to solve them, not when we want them solved. So very often something bad happens. It doesn't go the way we want it. But then 10 years later, we look back and we say, well, if that didn't happen, then this wouldn't happen, and this one I wouldn't have met this person, wouldn't have gotten married, wouldn't have had the kids. So I guess it was the best thing that could happen to me. Well, if it's the best thing that could have happened to you 10 years from now, it is the best thing that could have happened to you right now. It's just we don't want to believe that because we have our own sense of timing. And The Stranger in the Lifeboat is a lot about, do you believe that something, if you believe in a higher power, that it will guide you, even if it's not doing it like that?
Well, that's the question, right? And if you believe God loves you and cares for you, then it means you have to trust him with his time frame and I mean, look, these are the eternal questions, and it's delightful that someone like you is wrestling with them in this public way in the book, The Stranger in the Lifeboat. When you initially got on this, sort of the conversations that you were having with Morrie and you began to think about this stuff, did you feel, were you living in a world that was overly secular? In other words, I think a lot of times people in the professional world, particularly in writing and journalism, whatever, it's a secular world, and it's uncool to bring in God or the big questions.
Absolutely. You're 100% right. And I have had to wrestle, shall we say, with publishers about, hey, listen, you may think that, politically correct, we shouldn't say God because you might be insulting somebody here. It's not their God. But I can tell you, I live in Detroit. People don't hesitate. They say God bless you, all the time. And this is how people live. And you mentioned the phrase eternal questions. That's exactly what I wanted to raise in Stranger in the Lifeboat. And I get the opportunity, a rare opportunity for a writer, to put the questions that you would ask God if you, Eric, if I disappeared and God came on your show in my place and said, okay, you got 60 seconds. What do you want to know? I'm sure you'd have a bunch of questions lined up. Well, I put those questions in the mouths of the characters in this lifeboat. So they ask, well, do you hear prayers? Do you answer prayers? And this guy says, well, I answer every prayer, but sometimes the answer is no, which I found to be true in my life. Or, of course, the big question, why do people have to die? Why do people have to die? When one guy says, why did you take my wife? She died years ago.
Okay, now wait a second. This is too big. This is in show business. We call this a cliffhanger. Folks, you're not going anyplace. We'll be right back talking to Mitch Albom. Folks, I'm talking to Mitch Albom, who has written a novel called Stranger in the Lifeboat. Mitch, it seems like this is a parable. Would that be right? This is kind of a parable that you're telling? Because I don't want people to write to me and say, the way he describes God is not, it's not accurate according to my faith, whatever. This is meant to be a parable, meant to get people thinking. Right. That's right. It's not some new age version of God where you're leading people to the devil secretly. Okay, just want to be very clear. But you were just talking about the question of why do people have to die? Again, these are the ultimate questions. Everybody has them. Some people are afraid to admit it, but everybody wants to know. What's the story? Why do I die? Why is there death? Why everything? So talk about that.
Well, so in the book, there's this moment where, one of the characters asks the God, guy who claims to be God, well, why do people have to die? Why did you take my wife? I loved her. Why did you take my wife? And he's sobbing. And God says, the character who says he's God, it's a thriller. I can't give it away, but let's just say for the moment. The answer is, well, why is it that when people die on earth, people are always saying, why did God take them? Maybe a better question would be, why did God give them to us in the first place? What did we do to deserve their love, their sweetness, their memories? And he says, didn't you have those kinds of things with your wife, those memories? And he says, every day. And the God character says, well, those memories are a gift, but their absence is not a punishment. I'm not cruel. I know you before you're born. I know you after you die. This earth that you're on here now is just part of the journey. I know that you cry when your loved ones die and leave this earth, but I can assure you they're not crying. And for me, I wrote that as much, not just because I believe it, but as much for the readers as I did for myself, because I don't know, Eric, how much you know about me, but I operate an orphanage in Haiti. where I go every single month, and I've been there for the last 12 years. And about 8 years ago, we adopted one of the kids from the orphanage who had a brain tumor. Her name was Chica, and we brought her to America to try to find a cure. And she lived with us for 2 years as our daughter as we traveled around the world trying to find a cure. And in the end, we weren't able to. What she died from, nobody survives. It's called DIPG. And at the time, I was very angry with God. I was like, wait a minute. She was born 3 days before an earthquake in Haiti. She survived the earthquake when a building fell down around her, and she was 3 days old, and she lived. Her mother died 2 years later. She was brought to our orphanage. Then she gets a brain tumor, and then she dies. How can you be a loving God and do that to a 7-year-old? And I'm sure many people out there who have lost children who say the same thing. And so for a while, it was all about, why did you take her from us? Until, as time passed, I started to realize, well, wait a minute. My wife and I had wanted to have kids when we were married, but we got married kind of old, and it didn't happen. And here we were suddenly in our mid-50s, and we had this 5-year-old child sleeping at the base of our bed and waking us up for breakfast and joking and laughing and doing all the wonderful things that kids bring into your lives. This was an answer to our prayer from 15 years earlier, which is what I mean when I say God has his own timetable. And here was this answer to our prayer. And for 2 years, we had this amazing, wonderful family relationship with this beautiful little girl. So maybe instead of saying, why did you take her? I should say, why did I deserve to have her? What did I do to even warrant those 2 amazing years? And that was the way I dealt with it. And I think that's the way maybe a lot of people have to deal with loss, and that's why I put it in the Stranger in the Lifeboat.
Well, you're a little bit like John Milton, Paradise Lost. You're justifying the ways, or trying to justify the ways of God to man, trying to explain things that are not easily explicable. Listening to you reminds me, just recently I watched for the second or third time Shadowlands with Anthony Hopkins, the story of C.S. Lewis losing his wife of just a few years, Joy Gresham. And it's a similar thing. The pain is real, the loss is real, and Lewis, better than most, tries to make sense of it. And to some extent, that's what we're all doing in life. We're trying to make sense of everything. I guess I find it interesting that there are so many people that seem wedded to what we call it the atheistic narrative, because it seems so bleak and hopeless. And I guess maybe it's a reaction more than anything to some negative versions of faith that they have seen. Do you ever get angry atheists confronting you about, why are you putting God out there constantly?
No, I honestly, Eric, I think it's something else besides what you mentioned. I think it's a sense that we can control our own destiny, and we can create our own little godlike kingdoms. It's very interesting that up until the year 2000, church membership, synagogue membership, houses of worship membership stayed pretty even. It was about 70% in America, up a couple points, down a couple points, but pretty even through the whole century. And then since 2000 till now, it's dropped below 50%. It's in the 40s now. Well, what happened in 2000? The internet. That's what happened. And now the people create their own kind of little kingdoms with followers. I mean, even listen to the words. How many followers do you have? There's something very, very disturbing about that.
It's sick. It's sick. Let's be honest. How many followers do you have? How many disciples do you have? Yeah, pretty sick.
How many people give you a thumbs up like and are telling you they're with you? So when you can kind of create your own little universe, you feel like you don't have a need for God. And then all of a sudden you find yourself out in a lifeboat where your internet doesn't work and you don't have a signal. And suddenly what's the first thing you cry out for? God, please help me. And, maybe there are angry atheists or angry people who don't like what I'm bringing up, but I don't really hear from them. I think they're mostly concerned about themselves, and it wouldn't matter anyhow. This is what I believe, and I think it's important. And conversely, I hear much more from people like yourself and millions of other people around the world. Hal, thank you for writing something like this. It comforted me. I was dealing with these questions myself, and I don't write anything that hasn't comforted me. I don't put books out to try to aim at people's emotions. I write straight from things that I've gone through myself. And I think if you do that and you keep your eye on God, you're not going to do anything wrong.
You bring up a couple of important points. I'll drag you into the next short segment if your voice will hold out. Folks, I'm talking to Mitch Albom. The book is The Stranger in the Lifeboat. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. Don't go away. Hey there, folks. I'm talking to the multiple best-selling author, Mitch Albom. So many books, The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, Tuesdays with Morrie, and others. Okay, so the new book is called The Stranger in the Lifeboat. And you said something, Mitch, just a few minutes ago, but that when you first, when you bring books like this to publishers, it always strikes me that it is the people in what we would call the cultural elite circles that are the most hostile to faith or to God. It's almost as though they're trained to be uncomfortable by it. Whereas your average person, just living their lives, working hard, trying to raise their kids, they don't have any such discomfort. It's just kind of normal for them. Like you said, people say, God bless you. It's kind of a basic thing, and they don't get tortured about it. It's something that I've written about more recently in my new book, but I got to tell you that it's an interesting observation that for some reason, when you talked about the internet, it's almost accelerated a kind of a process of secularization, this illusion that we can be our own gods in a way.
Well, I agree 100%. And I mean, I guess we'll all find out in the end. But as I say, I've spent more time than most with people at the end. When you write Tuesdays with Morrie, that's kind of what comes with the territory. And I become, an expert and a person that people go to when they're in their dying days. And I've met an awful lot of people in their dying days. And I can tell you that what is giving them comfort in their dying days is not how much work they did, is not the size of their portfolio, is not, the some digits on an account somewhere. In fact, all the wealth that they've acquired, all the things that they own aren't even in the room with them. They're in the garage, they're in the bank vault, they're someplace else. And what gives them comfort is that human connection and the belief that there's something that's to come after we go. And so I feel sorry sometimes for people who go on a rampage about how dare you say God bless you to me. You're assuming that I believe in God. Well, okay, sorry, I didn't mean to offend you, but when that person gets to the end of their life,
right,
is that the conversation they really want to remember?
It's almost comedic. And speaking of which, I don't know, about 15 years ago, I live here in Manhattan in New York. I was walking down the street, literally walking to church with my wife and daughter. Daughter was in the stroller. And who do I see but the famous comedian, famous to me, Professor Irwin Corey, in his mid-90s, walking down the street. I said to my wife, honey, excuse me, you keep walking. I got to talk to this guy. I was like, I was awestruck that I get to meet him. And the first words out of my mouth, he said something. He said, I'm 97 or something like that, right? And I said, God bless you. He immediately said, why should God bless me? He didn't bless the Jews and the Holocaust. He just this volcano of anger. And I thought, wow, that's the response when somebody says, God bless you. And I thought some people have a hair trigger with this stuff. And it's kind of sad, really, especially at that age. But I know you've experienced it too. It's a bizarre thing. There's a wounding or there's something going on. And they don't seem to understand how bleak the worldview is when you say, okay, there's no God. And then what?
Right.
And then what,
Yeah.
Right? Then nothing.
I think people have become so polarized, so tribal in their politics and in their cultural things, whatever, that this just goes along with it. And it's like, well, your concept of God can't possibly be mine, or your God can't be mine, or we don't have anything in common. We always look for what's different between us. But I remember back to Morrie, to take this full circle, when I was sitting with Morrie one time, and we turned on the TV, and there was some footage from a war that was going on in Serbia, I think, at the time. And he started to cry. I said, Morrie, why are you crying? He said, this is just so terrible. Those poor people. And I said, yeah, but you don't know any of them. Have you ever been to Serbia? No. Do you even know what's going on there? No. I said, so why are you crying? I mean, tears were falling down. And he said, Mitch, when you get to the end and you realize what life is all about, you realize we are more alike than different. And you feel the pain of every other person who is suffering because you're suffering. And to me, that means we are all children of God. And we all ought to realize how much we have in common instead of our knee-jerk reaction being, oh, no, you can't be right because you have your take on it and I have my take on it, so you're
Beautiful.
wrong, you're the enemy, and I'm right. We are all in this together.
Beautiful place to end. Mitch Albom, the book is The Stranger in the Lifeboat. Congratulations and thank you, sir.
It's a pleasure, Eric. Thank you.